think it's on now.
Okay, I've just been told that the sound's not been on for that bit. So welcome everyone for Torah portion Acharei Mot. This Torah portion is called After the Death. It takes place after the death of Aharon's two sons, Nadav and Avihu. The Torah is often not in direct chronological order. It's not the events happening one after another in the order that they did in time. Often it's in what appears to be thematic order, where a theme or a topic like cleanness and uncleanness will be covered all at once. Now, it was in Leviticus 8 that we had the 8th day and Nadav and Avihu approaching with strange fire, and they died at that point. And this one is after the death. So we're 8 chapters later, and we have what happens after the events in Leviticus 8 through 10, the death of Aharon's sons on the 8th day. Now, what the Torah has been dealing with is clean and unclean. First of all, we had the animals that were clean and unclean, what was food and what wasn't. Last week we had Acharei Mot, which was leprosy, and about cleanness and uncleanness physically in our bodies, what is clean and unclean in this physical world. And that was kind of laying the groundwork, if you like, for what we're going to see in this Torah portion. And what this Torah portion deals with is the Day of Atonement. Okay, what we know is Yom Kippur. In the Hebrew, it's Yom HaKippurim, a Day of Atonement, in fact. But we needed that information on what was clean and what was unclean so that we can understand a Day of Atonement. Because the word atonement, the Hebrew word translated as atonement, doesn't actually mean what we think of in English as to make atonement for something. We kind of think of, I've done something wrong, so now I need to make atonement for that thing, make it better, basically. The Hebrew word is actually more to do with a cleansing. So after Aharon's sons died, then we had all of the information about clean and unclean, and now we can understand the information that we're going to see in this Torah portion. Now, regarding atonement, if you want a very good teaching on atonement, a very meaty, in-depth teaching, I would recommend the Torah portion, this Torah portion from last year. I went into what the Bible is actually teaching in a large number of passages, because atonement was made in the physical realm on the Day of Atonement. It's also made for us in the realm of the conscience by Yeshua's sacrifice. We've all heard that Yeshua made atonement for us, but perhaps we don't understand exactly what it means for Yeshua to have made atonement for us. And we can also make atonement by spiritual sacrifices. We'll kind of be looking at that more today. But this Torah portion from last year looks at passages like a lot of Paul's writings and reveals them to be what they are, which is very meaty treatises on the Torah, meaty explanations of the Torah from the perspective of Yeshua and from the perspective of spiritual sacrifices. Because sometimes we can read Paul's letters and they can kind of sound like they don't have very much to do with the Torah, that he's just kind of saying nice things, and he's like, oh, you should be nice, or Yeshua made atonement and he was a sweet smelling fragrance to Yehovah, and all of these things. And because we are not the Torah scholars that Paul was, we don't pick up on these things in the same way. So I try to go through a lot of what he wrote and show how he's actually teaching directly from the Torah and giving, he's expounding on it just in an incredible way. So if that's of interest to people, even if you know people who are very kind of Christian and like mainstream Christianity, I mean, and they're very into theology, and they take a lot of their theology from Paul, this would perhaps be a good teaching for them to watch. But if that sort of stuff is of interest to you, I would recommend that. This year, I'm going to explain what atonement is and then look at it through the lens of the spiritual sacrifices that we make and how they make atonement for us in the realm of the spirit. So the reason that atonement had to be made, very simply, was because Yehovah's tabernacle was in the middle of the tabernacles of the children of Israel. His tent was in the middle of their tents, and he was moving around with them in the wilderness. He was leading them by a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, and he was going about with them, with his people, actually physically there with him in the wilderness. The world, as we've been looking at over the past couple of weeks, is in a fallen state. The world now is subject to the curse. Yehovah has actually cursed the ground, and we saw a lot of the fallout from that in Torah portion Shmini a couple of weeks ago, about how the animals were left in a situation where they could either die or they could change their diet, and the place where they got that nutrition that they no longer got from the ground, which was cursed, was from eating one another. Now the curse affected the entire of creation. All of creation has fallen. Back before the curse, this is what we see. In Genesis 3 verse 8 it says, "And they heard the sound of Yehovah Elohim walking about in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yehovah Elohim among the trees of the garden." So at this point they have sinned, but the curse has not been put on creation. So Yehovah is walking about in the garden. He was walking with his people. They hid from the presence of Yehovah Elohim. Now for people to draw near to the presence of Yehovah Elohim, it has to be in his dwelling place, in the tent of meeting. That's where people could bring offerings in a way to draw near to him. In Genesis 3:22-24 it says, "And Yehovah Elohim said, See, the man has become like one of us, to know good and evil, and now lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." Then verse 23 kind of continues on in a bit of a strange way. It says, "So Yehovah Elohim sent him out of the garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken, and he drove the man out, and he placed cherubim at the east of the garden of Eden, and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life." Okay, so verse 22 says, and then he says, in case they put out their hand and eat of the tree of life. And then verse 23 says, so he sent him out of the Garden of Eden. It's almost like the statement in verse 22 is incomplete. There is something. In case he puts out his hand and eats of the tree of life and lives forever, and then you would expect a statement of what is going to be done, but instead it just says what he did. Now, the tree of life, Revelation tells us that the tree of life is in the midst of the paradise of Elohim. Now that word paradise, that Greek word for paradise, I think it's paradisos, that word isn't something recognizable to us from the Masoretic text. But if we go to the Septuagint, that word is used of Eden, which would make sense. Okay, the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God, that's Eden. Now, the prophet Ezekiel tells us that all of the trees of Eden are in Sheol. Yeshua, when he was on the cross, he said to the thief, today you will be with me in paradise. And that's that same word. Okay, the tree of life is in the midst of the paradise of Elohim. Yeshua uses that same word for where the thief will be with him that day. We know where Yeshua went. He went into the heart of the earth for 3 days. Okay? The heart of the earth is the way that Sheol is referred to. We also know that Yeshua's soul went to Sheol because Acts tells us that the Psalm 16, was written about him, where it says, you did not suffer my body to see corruption, nor leave my soul in Sheol. So Yeshua's soul went to Sheol. The thief was with him in paradise. All of the trees of Eden are in Sheol. The tree of life is in the paradise of Elohim. So it seems that this paradise of Elohim, the Garden of Eden, is currently in Sheol. Now, I don't know whether the continuation of verse 22, if it was there, would have been something along the lines of, let's put the Garden of Eden in Sheol and send him out. I don't know. I don't know whether the Garden of Eden was originally in the heart of the earth. We don't have that information. But we do know that Elohim sent them out of the Garden of Eden at this point. We also know that when we die, we go to be in Yehovah's presence. Told us earlier in Genesis 3 that they hid from his presence in the Garden of Eden. So all of that's very interesting. But the point being, right now, we are outside of the Garden of Eden. Yehovah cannot walk in our midst because now, after the curse, he's cursed the ground, and the ground is subject to the curse, and it's also subject to the cycle of life and death. Death, in fact, has dominion right now on the earth. So Yehovah cannot walk in the midst of his people in the same way. Adam and Eve were sent out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground. That was part of the curse as well, that they would have to till the ground by the sweat of their brow. So now, when Yehovah wants to dwell in the midst of his people, he needs to do it in a special dwelling place, a place which is not like any other place on the earth, a place that's been made exactly according to his instructions. And that place in the Hebrew text is called the Mishkan. You see there, Mishkan, dwelling place or tabernacle, and it's a noun. It's the name of that tent. Okay, it's the name of his house. The reason it's called the dwelling place is because it actually comes from this Hebrew word here, which is shekan. Shekan means to dwell. It's a verb. It's what you do. You dwell somewhere. It can also mean to tabernacle, because you can have a tabernacle where you tabernacle, where you do the verb tabernacle. It means to dwell or to inhabit or to abide in. So that's what Yehovah does in the special house that he had created for him. But even in this special house, this special environment where it's as clean as it can be, as holy as it can be, that is still in the midst of a fallen creation. We're going to see, in fact, that the temple in heaven is in the midst of a fallen creation also, and also has to be atoned for. But we'll get onto that. But Yehovah has to dwell in a place which is made out of things which are subject to the curse. So we can cleanse them, we can make them holy, but there still has to be a procedure which is done every year, known as the Day of Atonement, which is a special sort of cleansing. But we'll come on to that. So Yehovah is in his Mishkan, okay, where he Shekans, where he dwells. And his Mishkan is in the middle of the Mishkans of Israel. Numbers 24 verse 5 says, how good are your tents, O Yaakov, your Mishkanik, O Yisrael. Mishkanik is the plural of Mishkan. So Yehovah's Mishkan is in the middle of the Mishkans of Israel. 1 Chronicles 6 verse 48 says, and their brothers, the Levites, were appointed to every kind of service of the dwelling place, the Mishkan. And then it says, the house of Elohim. And that is literally in the Hebrew, Bayit Ha-Elohim, okay, which means literally his house. If we were to describe where we live, we could say that we live in a bayit. That's the Hebrew word for house. This is his house. This is where he dwells. We kind of, I don't know, we don't have the same kind of concept of what's going on as the very literal, real way that the scriptures describe. Yehovah was living right there among his people. He was leading them about in the wilderness, and he was dwelling among them. That's quite an incredible thing. We can appreciate that he dwells among us. He dwells inside of us in the form of his spirit. But that's different. That's his spirit. That's spiritual. This is physical. And that's how atonement works as well. It's the physical surroundings that his physical presence had. 1 Chronicles 17, 4-5 said, go and you shall say to my servant David, thus says Yehovah, you do not build me a house to dwell in, for I have not dwelt in a house since the time that I brought up Yisrael, even to this day, but I've gone from the tent to the tent and Mishkan and dwelling place. So this is when David says, I live in a fabulously splendid house and you are going about in a tent. So he wants Yehovah to have a nice house like he's got a nice house. This is something very real that we're seeing here, a very real world, very physical place on earth that is built for Yehovah to dwell in. Numbers 35, 33-34 says, and do not pollute the land where you are, for blood pollutes the land, and the land is not, the English word that they've used here is pardoned for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. But the Hebrew word is kafar, and that means to make atonement for. Kafar is a verb. So if the land is polluted by blood, okay, it cannot be atoned for except by the blood of him who shed it. And that is something that we see going all the way back to Genesis chapter 9. And do not defile the land in which you inhabit. And the word for defile there is tamei. We've got the tahor, which is the clean, and the tamei, which is the unclean. So do not defile the land means do not make the land unclean, in the midst of which I dwell. For I am Yehovah, dwelling in the midst of the children of Israel. He is holy. We are not to make the land in which he dwells unclean. We've got the unclean, which is then cleansed and becomes clean, or tahor, and then that becomes it is kadashed, it is made holy, it is made set apart. So the word kafar, you can see here, is a verb. It's saying here to cover, purge, make an atonement, make reconciliation, cover over with pitch. And the reason that it says cover over and with pitch is because the first time that we see it, and remember that's the outline of how Strong sees it used in scripture, that's not so much a strict definition. First time we see it used was in Genesis 6 verse 14. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and kafar it inside and out with tar. Okay, so it's interesting to me that this is an ark which is being spoken of, because the Day of Atonement, when we have to kafar, we have to make atonement, we do it and we sprinkle blood, or the high priest would sprinkle blood on the ark of Elohim, he would kafar the ark with the blood of animals. This word kofar is a word that comes from that verb. It's a noun which comes from that verb. Kafar is its verb root. And it's saying here, price of a life, ransom, bribe, asphalt, pitch as a covering. And the reason for that is it's used in that same verse. It says, you shall kafar it inside and out with kofar. So there is an aspect of what it is to kafar, to make atonement, which is a covering. Okay, and we kind of think of it more simplistically, or Christian theologians think of it more simplistically in terms of it's a covering which makes something better, makes reconciliation for something, or something along those lines. But what it is more closely is it's a covering with cleanliness, because to kafar means to clean. But you can kafar something which has already been made clean, and it's described as cleansing it. Something which is already clean, you can cleanse it with atonement, and it carries this connotation of perhaps a covering of some kind. So if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about an earthen vessel, and I was saying it would be debatable if you had varnished that earthen vessel, whether or not the food was touching the earthen vessel or whether it was touching the varnish, because the earthen vessel would have been covered over with a varnish. And regardless of whether or not a varnished pot is okay, if you think of that idea of it being varnished over and covered with something, that's kind of like what it is to make atonement for something. You take something clean and you make atonement for it. It's like, if I use this term from now on in this teaching, it's like covering with cleanness. Covering with cleanness. In Exodus 29:35 to 37, it says, and so you shall do to Aharon and his sons according to all I've commanded you. 7 days you shall ordain them, and prepare a bull each day as a chata'at, a sin offering for atonement. And that's a word that we'll probably all recognize. Kippur, people say the Day of Atonement is Yom Kippur. Atonement is a noun. Okay, if you've got making atonement, that's what you do. And then you've got atonement, which is what you've done. That is Kippur. And you shall cleanse the altar when you make atonement for it. Now the altar was already clean. The altar hadn't become unclean. But this atonement was kind of like this covering with another cleanness. A cleanness which has to be repeated year by year in order for Yehovah to be able to dwell in that tabernacle. For 7 days you shall kafar for the altar and set it apart, and the altar shall be most set apart. Okay, it is set apart from the set apart things. What those things which are already holy, it is made holy from those. Kind of in the same way as making atonement takes something which is clean and cleanses it. Whatever touches the altar is to be set apart. See the same sort of thing in Ezekiel 43. This takes place in the millennial kingdom. Okay, this is after Yeshua's return to the earth, when he leads us into the land. We see another similar process. It says, you shall bring them before Yehovah, and the priest shall throw salt on them and offer them up as a burnt offering to Yehovah. Prepare a goat for a sin offering daily for 7 days, and prepare a young bull and a ram from the flock, perfect ones. For 7 days they shall make atonement for the altar and cleanse it and ordain it. So a very similar process to the 7 days that were leading up to the 8th day. And when these days are completed, it shall be on the 8th day and thereafter that the priests make your olot. Okay, the burnt offering is an olah, and it's a feminine word. It will more often than not have a as an ending. The plural will more often than not be ot. So olot are burnt offerings, and your peace offerings, your shlamim, okay, im is a masculine plural ending. And on the altar, and I shall accept you, declares the Master Yehovah. So we see all of these offerings, and we're going to see them all. The olah, the mincha, the asham, the guilt offering, the chata'at, and the shlamim, the peace offerings. All of them make atonement in their own way. Yehovah doesn't, as far as I see in Scripture, explain to us exactly how all of that works. Okay, as he often doesn't explain why we are to do things, he just explains that we are to do them. But these various offerings make atonement in a certain way. It makes sense to us when we think of the English way we think of making atonement, that a sin offering makes atonement for sin. But it doesn't actually work that way. All of the offerings make atonement for iniquity. And we'll see verses that show us that. All of them make atonement for sin. It's just they seem to deal with different aspects. And Yehovah will say, okay, in this instance, what you're going to need is you're going to need the burnt offering with its mincha, and you're going to need the sin offering, or you're going to need the sin offering and the guilt offering. And he asks for these offerings in a certain combination, and they achieve something, some form of cleansing, or this covering with cleanness that Yehovah doesn't explicitly explain to us. He just tells us which offerings we're going to need to make atonement in that particular circumstance. Leviticus 12:6-7 says, and when the days of her cleansing are completed, okay, so her cleansing is completed at this point, for a son or for a daughter, so this is when somebody gives birth, she brings to the priest a lamb a year old as an olah, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove as a chata'at to the door of the tent of meeting. So in this circumstance, what's needed to make atonement is an olah and a chata'at, not because there's been any sin, but because these are the things that are required. We're going to see sin offerings offered when there is no apparent sin, but that's because to make atonement is something different to how we understand it. To make atonement is a certain type of covering, a certain type of cleansing which is done. And he shall bring it before Yehovah and kafar for her, and she shall be cleansed from the flow of her blood. She's already completed the days of her cleansing. She's washed herself. She's clean. But here we see that this atonement is made for her, and then she shall be cleansed from her flow of her blood. So this is, if you like, this final layer of varnish, this final layer of cleanness. This is the Torah for her who has given birth to a male or a female. Leviticus 14:48-53 says, however, if the priest indeed comes in and looks at it and sees that the plague is not spread in the house after the house was plastered, then the priest shall pronounce the house clean because the plague is healed. So at this point, the house is clean, and you'd be able to come into the house and you would not become unclean. And to cleanse the house, which he's just pronounced clean, he shall take 2 birds, cedar wood and scarlet and hyssop. So it's not actually physically in an unclean state of having zarat at that point, but this atonement, this covering needs to be made. Okay, the house needs to be cleansed by atonement. And he shall kill one of the birds in an earthen vessel over running water, and he shall take the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet and the live bird, dip them in the blood of the slain bird and in the running water, and shall sprinkle the house 7 times. He shall thus cleanse the house with the blood of the bird. And that's a strange concept to us, but according to the Torah, almost everything is cleansed by blood. Hebrews 9:22 tells you that, and we'll look at that later. And the running water and the live bird and the cedar wood, and with hyssop and with the scarlet. And he shall let the live bird loose outside the city in the open field, and shall kafar for the house and it shall be clean. Okay, so the word kippur mentioned before means atonement. But you'll see here at the bottom in the Strong's definitions, only in plural. It tells us that it comes from H3722, which is kafar, to make atonement, and it's only used in the plural. So the word is kippur. So when you look in Strong's what word is used there, you're going to see kippur, because Strong's won't tell you how the word is modified. But the way that this word is always modified is that it's always in the plural. That's the only way the kippur is used. So we call it Yom Kippur, but it's actually Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonements, the day that atonements are made, and multiple atonements are made on that day, in fact. Leviticus 23:27 says, on the 10th day of the 7th Chodesh, of the day of, it is the Day of Atonement, rather, Yom HaKippurim, it shall be a set apart gathering for you, and you shall afflict your souls, and shall draw near Karav with an Isha, an offering that's been made by fire, to Yahovah. Okay, so on this day, we're going to see that a number of atonements are made, and these are made by sacrifices in the earthly temple. Blood is shed to make that place where Yahovah appears clean. Okay, particularly on the mercy seat, because he's going to appear over the mercy seat. So the mercy seat is sprinkled with blood 7 times so that he can appear there. Okay, the word kaporet or kaporet, sometimes if you see in Strong's a th on the end, it's just due to different kind of dialects of Hebrew. Sometimes instead of Shabbat, you will see Shabbas in some dialects of Hebrew. Others you will see Shabbath there. Okay, but that is a T sound to our reckoning, according to the pronunciation that we use. So it's a kaporet. Exodus 25 verse 17 says, and you shall make a place of atonement. Okay, and that's the word kaporet. Place of atonement is probably a more direct translation than mercy seat. But if you're familiar with the term mercy seat, when you see place of atonement, that's what it is. It says to make it of tahor, gold. That's gold which is clean. And nothing makes this gold unclean, but once a year, atonement has to be made and blood has to be put on this gold, which is already clean, to atone for it, or to cover it, to make a covering for it of cleanness. And it's blood which achieves this for us. So when blood is shed, it can make atonement. If blood has been shed in the land, the blood of him who sheds it must be shed in order to make atonement for the land. Now we see this word used in a very interesting place in Psalm 78. Verse 25 says, men ate bread of angels, he sent provisions to satisfaction. He sent them provisions to satisfaction. He made an east wind blow in the heavens, and by his power he brought in the south wind, and he rained meat on them like the dust, and winged birds like the sand of the seas, and let them fall in the midst of his camp around his Mishkan. Okay, so the reason for atonement being made is because he's physically dwelling there in the Mishkan. These people were committing sin, were doing things contrary to what he had told them to do around his Mishkan. Okay, so how Yahovah responds to that when they're in the wilderness, more often than not, is that he sends a plague, and the people who are involved in that wickedness are the ones who are killed in the plague. But this plague, as we'll see as we go through this, also has another purpose. It actually makes atonement. And they are slain all around the place where he dwells. And their blood makes atonement. Their lives make atonement. So they ate and were completely satisfied, for he brought them what they desired. They had not turned away from their desire. Their food was still in their mouths when the wrath of Elohim came against them. And he slew among their fat ones, and he struck down the choice ones of Israel. In spite of all this, they still sinned. They did not believe in his wonders. So he ended their days in a breath and their years in trouble. When he slew them, then they sought him, and they returned and did earnestly seek Ale. They remembered that Elohim was their rock, and that the Most High Ale, their Redeemer. But they flattered him with their mouth. They lied to him with their tongue. For their heart was not steadfast with them, and they were not true to his covenant. But he, the compassionate one, pardoned iniquity. Not what it says. It says that he kafared iniquity. He made atonement for. He brought this cleansing which atonement brings for their iniquity. It says he did not destroy them. Many a time he turned his displeasure away and did not stir up all his wrath. So he didn't kill them all. In his compassion, what he did was he made atonement through their deaths for his dwelling place, which was in the midst of them. And it tells us that he did this in his compassion. He made atonement, but he did not kill all of them. So when we think of the plagues, we should remember that he is making atonement through these things also. Leviticus 1 verse 4 shows us that the olah, the burnt offering, shall be accepted to make atonement. So what we're going to see through the next few passages of scripture are that it's not just the sin offering that makes atonement. All of the offerings make atonement. So here, the burnt offering is accepted to make atonement. 1 Samuel 3 verse 14, and therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of the house of Eli shall never be atoned for by zevach, sacrifice. That's a word that's used of the peace offerings, or grain offering, or mincha. So we see here the peace offering and the grain offering would usually be accepted for to make atonement. But here he's saying, no, the house of Eli, no matter how many peace offerings and mincha they bring before me, they will never be atoned for. Their iniquity will not be atoned for. Leviticus 4 verse 20 says, and he shall do with the bull as he did with the bull of the Hata'at. So shall he do it. And the priest shall make atonement for them, and it shall be forgiven them. So obviously we can understand the sin offering makes atonement for sin. What is not immediately obvious to us, though, is that the other offerings also make atonement for sin. Leviticus 5 verse 6 says, and he shall come, Bo, with his asham, his guilt offering, to Yehovah for his sin which he has sinned, a female from the flock, a lamb or a female goat as a hata'at, and the priest shall make atonement for him for his sin. So for atonement to be made in this case, it's a guilt offering and a sin offering which are needed. And as I mentioned, Yehovah details for us the combination of offerings which are required in whichever circumstance to make atonement before him. For the children of Israel, if it's something that's done on a feast day, or for the individual. Ezekiel 45, 15 to 17 says, and one lamb from a flock, from 200, from the watered pastures of Israel, for grain offering, for a burnt offering, and for peace offerings to make atonement for them. So again, in the millennial kingdom, Ezekiel 40 through 48 detail the millennial kingdom. We've got the mincha, the olah, and the shlamim, the peace offerings, all making atonement. All the people of the land are to give this terumah, the room meaning to lift up, an offering, by implication being what's lifted up, to Yehovah, to the prince in Israel. And on the prince are the olot and the minchat, okay, both feminine Endings coming from words that end in a, ot, or at are common feminine endings, ot the most common, and drink offerings. At the festival, the Chodeshim, the Sabbaths, in all the appointed times of the house of Israel, he is to prepare the Chata'at and the Mincha and the Shlamim to make atonement for the house of Israel. So again, all of these offerings are used to make atonement. Leviticus 14 verse 14 says, "And the priest shall take some of the blood of the asham, and the priest shall put it on the tip of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, on the big toe of his right foot." So here we have atonement being made, again, in order for somebody to be cleansed. And the rest of the oil that's in the priest's hand, he puts on the head of him who is to be cleansed, and the priest shall make atonement for him before Yehovah. So again, atonement is necessary to make this man clean. And it's a guilt offering in this case. Leviticus 15, 1-2 says, "Yehovah spoke to Moshe and to Aharon, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his flesh, his discharge is unclean." Okay, so this is one of the things which is explained to us in the lead up to Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, parts of what makes you clean and what makes you unclean. So his discharge is unclean. And then this, later in Leviticus 15, is the procedure needed to make atonement. "And when he who has a discharge is cleansed of his discharge, then he shall count for himself 7 days for his cleansing, and shall wash his garments, shall bathe his flesh in running water, and at that point he is clean. On the 8th day he takes for himself 2 turtle doves, 2 young pigeons, and shall come into the presence of Yehovah to the door of the tent of meeting, and shall give them to the priest. And the priest shall prepare them, the one as a chata'at and the other as an olah, and the priest shall make atonement for him." And that making atonement for him makes him clean, even though he's already clean. Okay, so it's like this extra clean, this cleanness of cleanliness, if you want to put it in the same terms as the Holy of Holies. Leviticus 15:31 explains again why this is necessary. It says, "Thus you shall separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness." This is uncleanness. This is the concept. Tumah comes from what it is to be unclean, which is to be tameh. "Lest they die in their uncleanness," their tumah, "when they make my dwelling place unclean," when they defile, when they make it tameh, which is in their midst. So we've been told in this run-up of what it is that's going to make somebody unclean, because it's then explained to us at the end of Leviticus 15 that that will make his dwelling place unclean. And then in Leviticus 16 we get the procedure, even though it's out of chronological order, it happens just after the death of Aaron's sons, then we get explained to us how to make his dwelling place clean, even though it's in the midst of them. They've got to maintain that state of cleanliness for the dwelling place. They've got to not be unclean so that they don't defile it. But just because he's in the midst of those things which are subject to the curse, atonement needs to be made. That clean gold needs to be atoned for. Nothing unclean ever comes into the Holy of Holies to make it actually unclean. But this covering of cleanliness, if you like, needs to be put over the kaparet, the mercy seat, once a year. Hebrews 9:13-14 tells us, "For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the defiled, sets apart for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of the Messiah, who through the everlasting Spirit offered himself unblemished to Elohim, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living Elohim?" So people get confused with the fact that Yeshua was a sacrifice, because they confuse those temples. They confuse the earthly temple, the temple in heaven, and us as the temple of the Ruach. There's actually 3 different uncleannesses The scriptures teach that we become unclean in our conscience. They also teach that we become unclean in our spirit. The blood that was offered in the earthly tabernacle was for the cleansing of the flesh, also for the cleansing of the physical. We see the mercy seat, which is a physical gold object, being cleansed by blood. So that blood is for the cleansing of the physical and of the flesh. Messiah's blood was offered in the heavenly tabernacle, okay, the heavenly temple, and that cleanses our consciences so that we can get a clean slate, if you like, with Yehovah. He removes our guilt from us. So we see here earthly tabernacle and heavenly tabernacle. Hebrews 9 tells us something interesting. It tells us, according to the Torah, almost all is cleansed with blood, and without shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. It was necessary then that the copies of the heavenly ones should be cleansed with these. So the physical objects that were in the earthly tabernacle were all copies of what you will find in the heavenly tabernacle. And it was necessary that the copies were cleansed with blood. Then it says, but the heavenly ones themselves with better sacrifices than these. So it's not just the earthly tabernacle which needed to be cleansed. It was also the heavenly tabernacle which needed to be cleansed, and was cleansed by Yeshua's blood. It wasn't cleansed by the blood of animals, and couldn't be so. It was cleansed by Yeshua's blood. So why is that? There's a misunderstanding that I think that people have, which when I realized what it was, it made so much just make sense in a much clearer way to me. I think people think that the Father in heaven created the earth. Even if they thought about that statement, they'd think, oh, maybe that's not correct. But I think that that's what they think, that it was the Father who created in the beginning in Genesis. But that's not what the scriptures teach us. We know where the Father is. The Father's in heaven. You can see from Hebrews that the heavenly tabernacle needs to be cleansed. And that's because heaven itself is part of the creation. It says, in the beginning, God created, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. That's the heavens as well. They're part of the creation. Yehovah appears in heaven as the Father. At the same time, simultaneously, he was present in the dwelling place on the earth. The temple in heaven is a dwelling place for him. The temple on the earth was a dwelling place for him. And he was in both places at the same time. But that doesn't mean that there are two gods. Just as when his word appeared to Abraham and the Father was in heaven, that doesn't mean there's two gods. What it means is that Yehovah created the heavens and the earth, and he enters into his creation to appear in heaven as the Father. In the temple, he also appeared above the mercy seat. That's not two gods, that's one. When the Word appeared to Abraham, that wasn't another God. When the angel of Yehovah appeared, that wasn't another God. When he was the pillar of cloud by day, fire by night, that wasn't another God. When the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, that wasn't another God. Yeshua isn't another God. He is Yehovah. The Father is also Yehovah, but there is no contradiction that's created there. And I'm convinced that it's because people think that the Father in heaven was the one who did the creating. He wasn't, and that's not what the scriptures say. The scriptures say that he dwells in heaven, the Father dwells in heaven. Yehovah comes into his creation, and the places where he dwells need to be cleansed. And as we can see here from this scripture in Hebrews 9, the heavenly ones themselves were cleansed because they're part of the creation. For the intense longing of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of Elohim. For the creation was subject to futility. It doesn't say the earth. It says the creation. The creation was subject to futility. And now the earth was subject to futility, but it's the entire creation. Not from choice, but because of him who subjected it in anticipation that the creation itself also shall be delivered from the bondage to corruption into the esteemed freedom of the children of Elohim. We're also told that the fire which is going to remove that which is shaken will also destroy the heavens. The heavens and the earth are going to be burnt up. Not they're going to be burnt up and then an entire new thing is going to be created. As Hebrews 12 explains, that when that which is shaken is removed, that which cannot be shaken, that which is founded on his word, remains. The heavens, part of the creation, they needed to be cleansed. They needed atonement made for them. Now we'll see this atonement made on Yom Kippur on a future date. It says in Hebrews 9 that Yeshua made atonement in heaven. He appeared on Yom Kippur as the high priest at the end of the age. So it uses the past tense and says he's appeared, because the Hebrew will use the past tense to describe something that is so certain to happen that it is guaranteed. So it says he has appeared at the end of the age, because Yeshua will make atonement at the end of the age in heaven. And then the heavens and the earth will be purged by fire. Heavens, those things, the temple in heaven will be atoned for. It will be purged by fire. And that which is shaken will be removed. Same with the earth. All things will be made new. Doesn't mean that they're going to be made from scratch. It means that they're going to be restored. That which is shaken is removed. And that which is forever, that which is immovable, that remains. So with that understanding, we're going to come back. Now the time that I've put here is 3:15 our time. I think what would probably be better is if we come back in 35 minutes. We'll come back at 3 o'clock our time, so you can adjust those times. 35 minutes, we'll do the second part, and we'll look a bit at how we are a dwelling place of Elohim, how we are a temple, because just like the earthly tabernacle and the heavenly tabernacle, which need to be cleansed by making atonement, by offering sacrifices and offerings, atonement also needs to be made in that temple of the Ruach, because it is not a good thing, as we know, to defile the temple of the Ruach. We'll come back then.